Hello, and thanks for joining me today. My name is Jeff, and you're listening to episode 8 of the Comic Book of the Day podcast. Hey, happy Sunday. Today is October 23rd, and it's the Comic Book of the Day podcast. My name is Jeff, and we are talking about Brave and Bold number 151 today. Now, this is an interesting comic book. This was one that I have a lot of fond memories about, and when you thumb through this book, you see a lot of things that I absolutely remember as a kid, and this takes me right back to my childhood. This comic was published in June of 1979. Now, that's the cover date, June 1979, which means we can probably back out about 3 months, and this would have been May, April, March, so it would have been on the stands sometime around March or April of 1979. That means I would have been about 12 years old when this came out, and I was way deep into comic book collecting at about this time. This is when I was sort of in the thick of it. This was Brave and the Bold. So a little bit of background about Brave and the Bold for those of you who don't remember. It ran for about 200 issues, I believe it was. This is issue 151, and the previous month's issue, I remember 150, had gotten my attention. And I believe that might have been the very first issue of Brave and Bold that I bought. Was 150. So 150 was a anniversary issue, 150 issue celebration, and I remember it was a look back on. It had Batman on the cover with a whole sort of a background made up of various highlighted Brave and Bold issues from the past. So he was standing in the foreground with the background made up of previous issues of Brave and the Bold, and it was a question mark. It was that month's issue was Batman and a question mark. This month's issue is Batman and Flash. So this is, I believe, the issue 151 is called The Disco Dance of Death. It's a 1979, right smack dab in the middle of disco story. Flash and Barry Allen and Iris Allen are flown to Gotham City to be a part, to have a nice little vacation, compliments of Bruce Wayne. And they're being flown out to Gotham City as his guests for a VIP weekend of sorts so that they can have kind of a mini vacation away together, Iris and Barry. And during their nights out, apparently they go to this disco that's the Stardust Disco. It's like a big deal in Gotham City at the time, probably similar to like a Studio 54 type deal. And it's a pretty corny couple of pages when they're at the disco. There's a scene where Bruce Wayne is wearing a white suit, and behind him the words staying alive are sort of meant to invoke the Bee Gees or disco music or what have you. But it's a fairly corny issue, but it does have some cool Flash and Batman team up stuff in it. There's the typical Flash vibrating through walls and stuff to get out. So that was always a big treat when I was a kid. I always loved the fact that Flash could vibrate through things. And then this, of course, has there's a piece of this story that ties back to the 50s. I don't want to give too much away, but there's a Phantom of the Disco that's claiming lives, and Batman and Flash have to team up and solve the mystery of the Phantom of the Disco, and it looks like it takes them back to around the 50s or so, and Flash has to hop aboard the cosmic treadmill and make his way back to the past in order to help solve the mystery. I won't say exactly how, but it's good. Written by Bob Haney, drawn by Jim Aparo, who I feel is probably one of the top 2 or 3 Batman artists of all time. Brave and Bold was a really good comic if you were a kid who was spending your own money on comic books. And at the time, I think when I look back at the books that I'm, fondest of, or the books that I have the fondest memories of. It always seems to be, tied into a sort of a more bang for your buck idea. Brave and Bold is an excellent example of that. Brave and Bold is a title that started being, it was published in the 50s, and somewhere around issue 50 or so of Brave and Bold, they started superhero team-ups. 50, I believe, was the Martian... I believe it was the Martian Manhunter, and I can't believe for the life of me, I can't remember this now. It was Martian Manhunter and another hero teaming up. And for probably about a year or so, it was various random team-ups. I think we saw 54 was the first appearance of the Teen Titans. That was sort of a three-way team-up. And then 57, 58 was the origin of Metamorpho. So it was an ongoing kind of experimental superhero team-up title where they were pulling older superheroes out of retirement or golden age superheroes and pulling them forward, teaming them up with other heroes to see how, what would stick. And I think somewhere around, I want to say somewhere around the 70s, not the 1970s, but somewhere around the issues, 70, somewhere around the 70s, and about 20 issues after the superhero team up started, Batman started regularly teaming up every month. So starting at around maybe the 70s or 80s or so for the title, it became from that point on a monthly Batman team up book. So every month it was Batman and another superhero, and sometimes they would throw some wackiness in there. Some of the best Brave and Bold team ups are always, sort of the wacky team ups. Deadman was real popular. That was always a fun way to team Batman up with Deadman. Let's see. I think, Sergeant Rock was always interesting because Batman, it was always some sort of time travel, or maybe it was a story from Batman's past, or maybe it was Earth 2 Batman somehow, sometimes that's how they'd spin it. But it was always, Batman and someone. I think there were a couple of issues where Batman teamed up with Joker. That was always interesting because it was always sort of, when you're a kid and you see Batman teaming up with Joker, it's an instant draw because you're trying to figure out exactly, you look at the cover and you think, holy mackerel, what are the circumstances that lead Joker to team up with the Batman? So you have to imagine when you're 11, 12, 13 years old or something, those stories just, suck your money down. But the main thing about Brave and Bold was that, for 35 cents or 30 cents or 40 cents or whatever the price of the comics was around then, you could spend 35 cents, for instance, on a Batman comic, and you'd get a single 32-page, Batman story. You'd probably fight a villain or two, or but that you'd pay your hard-earned 35 cents, and you'd get a Batman story. But Brave and Bold and its sister title, DC Comics Presents, always teamed either Batman or Superman up. DC Comics Presents was monthly Superman team-ups, and Brave and Bold was monthly Batman team-ups. So if you were looking to spend your 35 cents at the spinner rack, and you're looking through all of the comic books on the spinner rack, you'll always stop when you have a book like, Batman and Plastic Man, or Batman and Hawkman, or, Batman and the Flash. I don't have to buy a Flash comic, and I don't have to buy a Batman comic because that would represent about 70 cents, right? So for 35 cents, I can actually get Batman and Flash together in the same book. So as a kid, it always struck me that some of my fondest memories in some of my favorite comics are always sort of a value proposition for me. I got more bang for my buck when I bought a Brave and Bold than if I just bought a Flash book or if I just bought a Batman book. But that was sort of what I looked for when I was younger. The cool thing about this particular book in my collection, and if you go to comicbookoftheday.com, you can check it out, is that this is what's called a Whitman variant. And I use the word variant loosely. It's not exactly like a variant like we have today, right? It's not the same exact thing. But these variants were a lot of times you could take Whitman Comics was a division of Gold Key, and they were a toy company in the late 70s and early 80s that had distribution deals with Marvel and DC. So if you went to a toy store, or if you went to like a drugstore or a Woolworths, or one of these places that sold toys, a department store, Whitman Toys and Whitman Comics would be you could run across these in toy stores, and it was usually a bagged 3-pack of comics. So I probably got this in a bag with 2 other comic books, and I think you paid probably 99 cents or 75 cents or something like that for 3 comics, and all they were was the exact same issue with a Whitman logo slapped over the DC Comics logo. So in the top left corner, where it would normally say DC Comics, this just has a little Whitman logo in the top left corner. And I remember, probably for a couple years, probably for like 5 or 10 years after these books came out, that if you ran across them in boxes or at comic book conventions or shows, they weren't very desirable, right? Because they weren't actual, you didn't have a DC Comics logo on there. You had a Whitman logo on there. And they were books that I remember I wasn't necessarily too attached to these books when I was younger, because I sort of considered them fake. They were fake DC. They weren't real comic books. They were fake comics. They had the same insides, but for a purist, that was just something that you didn't mess around with. But later on, as when you're flipping through Overstreet, a lot of times when you see Brave and Bold number 151 in Overstreet, you'll see that there's a Whitman variant, and as a result of the fact that the variant had a low print run and a low distribution, much lower than the regular Brave and Bold 151. Let's say Brave and Bold 151 had a distribution of about 250,000. Whitman variant Brave and Bold 151 might have a print distribution of 15,000-20,000, something of those on those orders of magnitude. So you would have far fewer Whitman comics out in the world than you would regular DC Comic Brave and Bolds. So later on, much over the last probably 5 or 10 years, those variants have become sought after, and they command a higher price. Usually at comic shows, when you run into them, they command about the same price when they're in sort of around the mid-grade area, but once they start getting into higher grades, they become really rare, and they become much more sought after. So this is a Whitman Comics variant edition of Brave and Bold 151. I have 2 copies of this book. I have the regular DC Comics copy and the Whitman copy, and I usually will display the Whitman copy and put the regular copy on the other side behind the backing board in the same bag. So I usually, if I have 2 copies of a comic, I'll usually put them in the same bag and bag the extra comic in the back. But in the case of the Whitmans, I'll turn them around and have the Whitman logo on the front and have that be the front comic that's displayed in the bag. So there you have it. Today's comic book of the day is Brave and Bold number 151. This was published in June of 1979, which meant it was on the newsstands around the spring of 1979. So that is your comic book of the day. If you'd like to go check this comic book out and see what that Whitman logo is all about, you can go to comicbookoftheday.com. That's where we're located. We're also on Twitter at cboftheday.com. You can reach out, ask us questions, send us some feedback, tell us what you think about the show. You can also follow us on Facebook at Comic Book of the Day on Facebook. We post the show every single day there, and we're also on Instagram. If you'd like to follow along and see some of these comic books on Instagram as well, you can follow us at Comic Book of the Day on Instagram as well. So we are the Comic Book of the Day, and we thank you very much for your time. We'll be back tomorrow with a war comic. I'm not going to spoil which one, but we'll be diving into World War II and some war comics tomorrow. So looking forward to that, and I will see you tomorrow. Thanks again.